Martin Van Buren was the 8th President of the United States, 1837–41, and one of the founders of the Democratic Party. He was known as the Little Magician to his friends, and the Sly Fox to his enemies, in recognition of his reputed cunning and skill as a politician. Martin Van Buren said that the two happiest days of his life were his entrance into the office of president and his surrender of the office. While his political opponents were glad to see him go, they nicknamed him Martin Van Ruin. Many Americans were not. Even though he lost the 1840 presidential election, Van Buren received 40,000 more votes than he had in his 1836 victory. In subsequent years, historians have come to regard Van Buren as integral to the development of the American political system. Martin Van Buren was an American lawyer, diplomat, and statesman who served as the 8th President of the United States from 1837 to 1841. A primary founder of the Democratic Party, he served as New York's Attorney General and U.S. Senator, then briefly as the 9th Governor of New York before joining Andrew Jackson's administration as the 10th United States Secretary of State, Minister to Great Britain, and ultimately the 8th Vice President when named Jackson's running mate for the 1832 election. Van Buren won the presidency in 1836 against divided Whig opponents. Van Buren lost re-election in 1840, and failed to win the Democratic nomination in 1844. Later in his life, Van Buren emerged as an elder statesman and an important anti-slavery leader who led the Free Soil Party ticket in the 1848 presidential election. Van Buren was born in Kinderhook, New York, where most residents were of Dutch descent and spoke Dutch as their primary language. He is the only president to have spoken English as a second language. Trained as a lawyer, he entered politics as a member of the Democratic-Republican Party, won a seat in the New York State Senate, and was elected to the United States Senate in 1821. As the leader of the Bucktails faction, Van Buren emerged as the most influential politician from New York in the 1820s and established a political machine known as the Albany Regency. He ran successfully for governor of New York to support Andrew Jackson's candidacy in the 1828 presidential election but resigned shortly after Jackson was inaugurated so he could accept appointment as Jackson's Secretary of State. In the cabinet, Van Buren was a key Jackson advisor and built the organizational structure for the coalescing Democratic Party. He ultimately resigned to help resolve the Petticoat affair and briefly served as ambassador to Great Britain. At Jackson's behest, the 1832 Democratic National Convention nominated Van Buren for vice president, and he took office after the Democratic ticket won the 1832 presidential election. With Jackson's strong support and the organizational strength of the Democratic Party, Van Buren successfully ran for president in the 1836 presidential election. However, his popularity soon eroded because of his response to the Panic of 1837, which centered on his independent treasury system, a plan under which the federal government of the United States would store its funds in vaults rather than in banks. More conservative Democrats and Whigs in Congress ultimately delayed his plan from being implemented until 1840. His presidency was further marred by the costly Second Seminole War and his refusal to admit Texas to the Union as a slave state. In 1840, Van Buren lost his re-election bid to William Henry Harrison. While Van Buren is praised for anti-slavery stances, in historical rankings, historians and political scientists often rank Van Buren as an average or below-average U.S. president, due to his handling of the Panic of 1837. Van Buren was initially the leading candidate for the Democratic Party's nomination again in 1844, but his continued opposition to the annexation of Texas angered Southern Democrats, leading to the nomination of James K. Polk. Growing opposed to slavery, Van Buren was the newly formed Free Soil Party's presidential nominee in 1848, and his candidacy helped Whig nominee Zachary Taylor defeat Democrat Lewis Cass. Worried about sectional tensions, Van Buren returned to the Democratic Party after 1848 but was disappointed with the pro-Southern presidencies of Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan. During the American Civil War, Van Buren was a war Democrat who supported the policies of President Abraham Lincoln, a Republican. He died of asthma at his home in Kinderhook in 1862, aged 79. Martin Van Buren was born in the rural town of Kinderhook, New York, on December 5, 1782. His father, Abraham, owned a successful inn and small farm. The Van Buren Tavern served as a hub of social activity for the town, and the constant coming and goings of travelers between New York City and the state capital of Albany brought young Martin into contact with all sorts of people, both free and enslaved. In 1807, Martin married Hannah Hose and the two had 5 children, but Hannah tragically died in 1819, long before Van Buren ascended to the presidency. Van Buren studied law and quickly became immersed in New York politics. He rose rapidly through the ranks of the Democratic-Republican Party and became the leader of the Bucktail faction. In 1821, the state legislature elected Van Buren to represent New York in the United States Senate, where he served until he resigned to become the governor of New York. He held this office briefly before accepting the position of Secretary of State for President Andrew Jackson. Van Buren's political ascent continued when he sided with President Jackson, Secretary of War John Eaton, and Eaton's wife Margaret during the scandalous Petticoat Affair. As the president's relationship with Vice President John C. Calhoun deteriorated, Jackson asked Van Buren to serve as the U.S. Minister to the United Kingdom. During Van Buren's confirmation hearing in the Senate, Vice President Calhoun delivered the decisive nay vote, confident that it would destroy Van Buren's career and sabotage his political ambitions. Instead, the episode brought Van Buren closer to Jackson and elevated his reputation among Democrats. President Jackson asked him to join the 1832 ticket as his vice president, and after Jackson's re-election, Van Buren became one of the president's closest advisors and confidants. When Jackson decided not to run for a third term, Vice President Van Buren was the natural choice to succeed him. Van Buren's strong support of Jackson's agenda along with his northern roots gave him broader appeal to the electorate, and he defeated a crowded field of candidates in 1836. He became the first president to use the term slavery in an inaugural address, affirming his support for the institution. As president, Van Buren continued many of his predecessors' policies, including the forcible removal of thousands of Native Americans from their lands. His administration's involvement in the United States v. Amistad case on behalf of the Spanish government was viewed as a defense of slavery, though it lost the case at the United States Supreme Court. He did draw a sharp contrast to Jackson on the issue of Texas, as Van Buren believed annexation of a territory that permitted slavery would incite political discord and likely instigate a war with Mexico. During his time in the White House, President Van Buren relied upon free and enslaved African Americans to operate and maintain the president's house. This mix of staff was not unusual, as many of his predecessors had done the same, and Van Buren himself had previously used both free and enslaved labor at Decatur House while he served as Secretary of State. However, more attention was paid to his household expenditures rather than who was working in his house. The Panic of 1837 was one of the worst economic depressions in the young country's history. As a result, critics accused the president of living lavishly while ordinary Americans struggled to make ends meet. This perception and the running of a popular war hero in William Henry Harrison contributed to Van Buren's defeat in his re-election campaign. In 1844, Van Buren was poised to reclaim leadership of the Democratic Party, but his opposition to the annexation of Texas ultimately hurt him with Southern delegates and those that favored westward expansion. Van Buren made one more attempt to return to the White House in 1848 as the presidential candidate for the Free Soil Party, a party that was formed to oppose the expansion of slavery into the Western Territories. Major General Zachary Taylor ultimately won the 1848 election, and Van Buren never ran for political office again. Martin Van Buren was appointed Secretary of State by President Andrew Jackson on March 6, 1829. Van Buren served in that capacity from March 28, 1829, to March 23, 1831. He was an astute career politician who approached foreign affairs with caution. Van Buren was born in Kinderhook, New York to parents of Dutch heritage. He attended village schools and became a law clerk at age 14, going on to study law and to join the bar in 1803. After moving to Hudson, New York, Van Buren served as the surrogate of Columbia County from 1808 to 1813. He entered politics with election to the state senate, where he served from 1813 to 1820. He then became the New York Attorney General from 1816 to 1819. Van Buren next won election to the United States Senate, serving from 1821 to 1828, and became governor of New York in 1829. He resigned as governor to join the cabinet of President Andrew Jackson as Secretary of State. Following his 3 years as secretary, Van Buren was elected vice president under Jackson and served from 1833 to 1837. Van Buren won the presidential election of 1836, becoming the 8th president and serving until 1841. Jackson provided Van Buren an entree to foreign affairs. Jackson selected Van Buren as Secretary of State as a reward for Van Buren's efforts to deliver the New York vote to Jackson. As president, Jackson was hesitant to relinquish control over foreign policy decisions or political appointments. Over time, Van Buren's ability to provide informed advice about domestic policies, including the Indian Removal Act of 1830, won him a place in Jackson's circle of closest advisors. Van Buren's tenure as Secretary of State included a number of successes. Working with Jackson, he reached a settlement with Great Britain to allow trade with the British West Indies. They also secured a settlement with France, gaining reparations for property seized during the Napoleonic Wars. In addition, they settled a commercial treaty with the Ottoman Empire that granted U.S. traders access to the Black Sea. However, Jackson and Van Buren encountered a number of difficult challenges. They were unable to settle the main New Brunswick boundary dispute with Great Britain, or advance the U.S. claim to the Oregon Territory. They failed to establish a commercial treaty with Russia and could not persuade Mexico to sell Texas. Van Buren resigned as Secretary of State due to a split within Jackson's cabinet in which Vice President John C. Calhoun led a dissenting group of cabinet members. Jackson acquiesced and made a recess appointment to place Van Buren as U.S. Minister to Great Britain in 1831. While in Great Britain, Van Buren worked to expand the U.S. consular presence in British manufacturing centers. His progress was cut short when the Senate rejected his nomination in January of 1832. Van Buren returned to the United States and entered presidential politics, first as Jackson's vice president and then as president. While serving as chief executive, Van Buren proceeded cautiously regarding two major foreign policy crises. He worked to defuse a potential breach with Great Britain when Maine farmers attacked across the northern border and when Canadians burned the U.S. vessel Caroline in the Niagara River. Van Buren was also wary of worsening U.S. relations with Mexico. He declined to support the U.S. annexation of Texas, which would have added a slave state to the Union. The former president lived out the rest of his life at Lindenwold, where he died on July 24, 1862. Van Buren never sought public office again after the 1848 election, but he continued to closely follow national politics. He was deeply troubled by the stirrings of secessionism in the South and welcomed the Compromise of 1850 as a necessary conciliatory measure despite his opposition to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Van Buren also worked on a history of American political parties and embarked on a tour of Europe, becoming the first former U.S. president to visit Britain. Though still concerned about slavery, Van Buren and his followers returned to the Democratic fold, partly out of the fear that a continuing Democratic split would help the Whig Party. He also attempted to reconcile the barn burners and the Hunkers, with mixed results. Van Buren supported Franklin Pierce for president in 1852, James Buchanan in 1856, and Stephen A. Douglas in 1860. Van Buren viewed the fledgling Know Nothing movement with contempt and felt that the anti-slavery Republican Party exacerbated sectional tensions. He considered Chief Justice Roger Taney's ruling in the 1857 case of Dred Scott v. Sandford to be a grievous mistake since it overturned the Missouri Compromise. He assessed that the Buchanan administration handled the issue of bleeding Kansas poorly, and saw the Lecompton Constitution as a sop to Southern extremists. After the election of Abraham Lincoln and the secession of several Southern states in 1860, Van Buren unsuccessfully sought to call a constitutional convention. In April 1861, former President Pierce wrote to the other living former presidents and asked them to consider meeting to use their stature and influence to propose a negotiated end to the war. Pierce asked Van Buren to use his role as the senior living ex-president to issue a formal call. Van Buren's reply suggested that Buchanan should be the one to call the meeting, since he was the former president who had served most recently, or that Pierce should issue the call himself if he strongly believed in the merit of his proposal. Neither Buchanan nor Pierce was willing to make Pierce's proposal public, and nothing more resulted from it. Once the American Civil War began, Van Buren made public his support for the Union cause. Van Buren's health began to fail later in 1861, and he was bedridden with pneumonia during the fall and winter of 1861 to 1862. He died of bronchial asthma and heart failure at his Lindenwold estate at 2 a.m. on Thursday, July 24, 1862. He was 79 years old. He is buried in the Kinderhook Reformed Dutch Church Cemetery, as are his wife Hannah, his parents, and his son Martin Van Buren Jr. Van Buren outlived all four of his immediate successors, Harrison, Tyler, Polk, and Taylor. In addition, he saw more successors ascend to the presidency than anyone else, 8, living to see Abraham Lincoln elected as the 16th president before his death. Van Buren's most lasting achievement was as a political organizer who built the Democratic Party and guided it to dominance in the second party system 257, and historians have come to regard Van Buren as integral to the development of the American political system. According to historian Robert V. Remini, Van Buren's creative contribution to the political development of the nation was enormous, and as such he earned his way to the presidency. After gaining control of New York's Republican Party, he organized the Albany Regency to run the state in his absence while he pursued a national career in Washington. The Regency was a governing council in Albany consisting of a group of politically astute and highly intelligent men. It was one of the first statewide political machines in the country whose success resulted from its professional use of patronage, the legislative caucus, and the official party newspaper. In Washington he labored to bring about the reorganization of the Republican Party through an alliance between what he called the Planters of the South and the Plain Republicans of the North. His Democratic emphasized the importance of building popular majorities, and it perfected political techniques which would appeal to the masses. Heretofore parties were regarded as evils to be tolerated. Van Buren argued that the party system was the most sensible and intelligent way the affairs of the nation could be democratically conducted, a viewpoint that eventually won national approval. However, his presidency is considered to be average, at best, by historians. He was blamed for the Panic of 1837 and defeated for re-election. His tenure was dominated by the economic conditions caused by the panic, and historians have split on the adequacy of the independent treasury as a response. Some historians disagree with these negative assessments. For example, libertarian writer Yvonne Eland, in his 2009 book Recarving Rushmore, ranked Van Buren as the third greatest president. He argues that Van Buren handled the Panic of 1837 well, and praised Van Buren for reducing government spending, balancing the budget, and avoiding potential wars with Canada and Mexico. Historian Jeffrey Rogers Hummel states that Van Buren was America's greatest president, arguing that historians have grossly underrated his many remarkable accomplishments in the face of heavy odds. Several writers have portrayed Van Buren as among the nation's most obscure presidents. As noted in a 2014 Time magazine article on the top 10 forgettable presidents, making himself nearly disappear completely from the history books was probably not the trick the little magician Martin Van Buren had in mind, but his was the first truly forgettable American presidency. During his re-election campaign, Martin Van Buren attempted to bring the phrase "OLL correct," which was a slang word for good used by the elite, to the common folk of the United States of America. He used the campaign slogan, "Martin Van Buren is okay." The abbreviation stuck and took the world by storm, eventually becoming the modern word okay. This leads to many attributing the word to Van Buren. Van Buren's home in Kinderhook, New York, which he called Lindenwold, is now the Martin Van Buren National Historic Site. Counties are named for Van Buren in Michigan, Iowa, Arkansas, and Tennessee. 266 Mount Van Buren, U.S Van Buren, 3 state parks and numerous towns were named after him. In Gore Vidal's 1973 novel Burr, a major plot theme is an attempt to prevent Van Buren's election as president by proving he is the illegitimate son of Aaron Burr. During the 1988 presidential campaign, George H.W. Bush, a Yale University graduate and member of the Skull and Bones Secret Society, was attempting to become the first incumbent vice president to win election to the presidency since Van Buren. In the comic strip Doonesbury, artist Gary Trudeau depicted members of Skull and Bones as attempting to rob Van Buren's grave, apparently intending to use the relics in a ritual that would aid Bush in the election. Martin Van Buren appeared in the presidential dollar coin series in 2008. The U.S. Mint also issued commemorative silver medals for Van Buren, released for sale in 2021. Van Buren is portrayed by Nigel Hawthorne in the 1997 film Amistad. The film depicts the legal battle surrounding the status of slaves who in 1839 rebelled against their transporters on La Amistad slave ship. On the television show Seinfeld, the 1997 episode The Van Buren Boys is about a fictional street gang that admires Van Buren and bases its rituals and symbols on him, including the hand sign of 8 fingers pointing up. In an episode of The Monkees, Dance, Monkey, Dance, a dance instruction studio offers free lessons to anyone who can answer the question, who was the 8th President of the United States? Martin Van Buren, portrayed by Stephen Coit, appears at the studio to claim the prize. At least 2 bands have incorporated Van Buren as part of their name, the Illinois-based The Van Buren Boys and the Van Burens from Quincy, Massachusetts. Thank you for watching this video.